Okay, well, in the interest of being prompt, and we appreciate everybody signing in and sharing your time with us. So Carrie will admit people as they sign in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to our Davis Climate Action and Adaptation Plan workshop. This is our public workshop number 2, where we're going to be talking about mobility in public spaces. So next slide. So our meeting objectives today are to get everybody's input on actions to address our greenhouse gas reduction, the wildfire smoke, air quality, extreme heat, flooding, and drought, as it relates to mobility, which includes transportation, vehicles, transit, electric vehicles, cycling, and walking. And then also in public spaces, such as streets and sidewalks, community trees, nature-based storm water systems, parks, open spaces, and habitat. And the format tonight is that we're going to be having everybody tell us what they would like to see the actions be. So we'll have breakout sessions where we'll have time to get everybody's input on what they think the action should be in order to address these issues. And then just to remind everybody, we are repeating this meeting Friday at 10 o'clock for other people who the evening meeting didn't work. And then our next 2 meetings are going to address buildings and water and wastewater. So we will be getting to that. And next slide. And then I'm just going to hand it over to Carrie. Oh, first of all, I guess I should introduce myself. So I'm Diana Jensen, City Engineer and the Project Director for the Climate Action Adaptation Plan. And then I will turn it over to Carrie.
Well, hi, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. We're looking forward to talking with you today about the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. We're going to start with some introductions about the project goals and process, and a little bit about the input that we've already gotten through the survey, the previous workshops, the introductory workshops, which we've had before, and then we're going to move into a recap of some of the input with some of the information and goals that have been identified. And then the majority of the meeting is going to be a Mural program, which is a whiteboard type program that you might see us using at the farmers market in person with sticky notes. And this one is an ability to do that online. So we'll spend close to an hour on 2 different breakouts, and Josh is going to tell us more about that when we get to that point. Diana will tell us a bit about the next steps in this process, and the exciting moment at the end is that we will be identifying the randomly selected Raffle prize winner, and you can see a photograph of that on this slide. Staff will remain in the meeting a bit after 6:30 for anybody to ask questions or provide additional information, and I think that's an introduction of what we're hoping to do. Next slide. So many of you have seen some of this information before. The project goals for the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan are to support the City Council actions to have the community attain carbon neutrality by 2040 with an interim goal of 2030. This is being expanded on the existing 2010 Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, and also meets the state goals for carbon neutrality by 2045. A lot of this is based on the climate emergency resolution that was adopted by Council in 2019. As part of the CAP, or Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, we are prioritizing equity and inclusion, and actually had an entire workshop to discuss some of those goals. the target is with the GHG reduction for 2030 goes along with the state's both the state's target and the city target goals. In addition to carbon reduction, the CAP also identifies strategies to reduce climate risk and to create a vulnerability assessment, and finally to comply with state legislation. Next slide. So this schedule that's on the screen is where we are. We actually signed the contract with AECOM in early to mid-December and spent a bit of time doing some of the background work, and had our first workshop on Earth Day on April 22nd, the second workshop on community resilience and equity on May 27th. And right now, we're in our first of 2 workshops, each one of them being presented twice. These are workshops 2 and 3. So you can see the actions up above at the top. What I would like to say is that we are still in the development of priorities and potential actions phase. So none of this is going to be finalized until after workshop 4 in early to mid-October. Once we finish the report to council that will have the draft plan in it and the public review process, we'll be doing the environmental review and CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. So next slide. So I think we've already talked a little bit about this. Some of the outreach that we've already done is we had a first online survey, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the results that came out of that. The 2 workshops that we talked about. We do have a technical advisory committee, which we basically just vet ideas before presenting them to the community. So everything that we've talked about with the technical advisory committee, or TAC, has also been presented to the public. And then the community resilience and equity workshop. There have been a lot of other potential outreach opportunities for people to join in the discussion. There was a Cool Davis Coalition with a panel in May. There are commission staff reports that go to all commissions every month. The Natural Resources Commission has been the lead advisory body, and we do monthly updates at the NRC, and other commissions are able to have a representative that goes to those meetings and joins in the discussion. Other outreach has included staff reports, emails and communication from the public, doing things such as visiting the farmers market and other meeting in a box type opportunities where we go out to hard to reach community members and talk with them directly. And so in red at the bottom is what I said previously. We just want to emphasize that these actions are not finalized at this time. We are working on finalizing the actions, and we'll be bringing them to the community before completing the draft CAP, Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. Next slide. Do we want to go to the next slide?
I'm seeing survey number 1 debrief slide. Is that not showing?
Well, my screen may be frozen. I'm still seeing community outreach review. As I recall, that survey slide, it talks about both the information that we collected from the survey. We had over 230 participants, as well as some of the gaps in, here we go, now I can see that, So some of the key topic areas and some of the gaps that we still need to address. For example, we had a large majority of homeowners that replied to the survey and a much smaller group of renters, but that doesn't necessarily match the Davis demographics. We need to reach out more to the student population to make sure that we get some of that participation active. Other hard to reach groups, Spanish speakers, and as I said, renters, others. So we're going to make sure to incorporate some of the equity and hard to reach community members in our outreach because we've identified that there are some gaps. The graph that's there is a question that was asked during the survey about which are the most important extra benefits to community members beyond carbon reduction and climate risk assessment and actions. And so people could select up to 3 options. And as you can see, there was a high preference for making sure that we address having better air quality, especially during extreme weather events. Environmental stewardship was very important to the community, and some of the other top-ranked issues were more parks and open space, water conservation, and waste reduction. So all of this information is going to be brought into our assessment of which actions we want to prioritize, and using the tool, how we weight some of those options. Next slide. And again, I'm still seeing the survey. Here we go. So I'm going to turn it over now to Diana Edwards to talk about some of those specific goals.
All right, thank you, Carrie. And everyone, I'm Diana Edwards. I'm the project manager for AECOM. I'm the consultant helping the city develop the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. So now that we've heard some initial ideas from the city, from the community, I want to kind of go through the process that we're going through as we kind of develop these actions, kind of what we're moving into, what we're doing today. As Carrie just about a little bit. So we've received some great input and initial ideas on the actions and opportunities. And we've also done a thorough review of what the city has done to date, identified some of the barriers and issues relating to implementing the prior climate action plan actions, as well as some ideas from our technical project staff. Today, we'll be hearing more ideas from folks about the opportunities specifically on mobility and public spaces. And then, as we discussed already, in 2 weeks, we'll be gathering ideas on buildings, waste, and water. So as you can see here, our development process highlighted in yellow is kind of what we've done, where we are, and then where we're moving forward to. So kind of where we are right now is we're gathering all of this input, and we're developing a targeted and consolidated list of actions that we'll then evaluate for greenhouse gas reduction potential, for the ability to improve equity, and evaluate based on some of the co-benefits that we've identified through the public outreach process. We will then prioritize the actions, and at our last workshop in October, get input from you all here on the prioritized list of actions and confirm our priorities. The final step then will be to build out more details of that short list of prioritized actions in collaboration with the city. Next slide. So I want to go through what some of the adaptation actions are, and these are actions that will help us adapt to climate change, which, as we all just lived through these heat waves, it's already here and will continue. So how are we going to adapt to that? So I'm going to run through our framework for the adaptation action development and give some highlights on what we've heard from the community. Josh will then do the same for our greenhouse gas reduction. We have the results from the vulnerability assessment, which I presented on at one of our last workshops. That's our baseline, as well as the community concerns that we've heard, and we're going to use those as a baseline to focus our adaptation actions. So we tend to think about these actions in 3 different buckets. We have structural, governance, and informational. Structural actions are physical interventions which might, for example, adapt an asset through protection, be that raising a school out of a floodplain, building a berm, or providing shade at a bus stop to protect you from kind of an extreme heat day. Governance actions are policy oriented. This would be putting in place an ordinance or guidance that will build in more resilient features to a project. For example, updating guidance about design standards for storm events or updating emergency response protocols around extreme heat. And finally, we have informational actions can be continuing studies that the city may want to do. Each of these actions can be applied at different scales. They could be asset specific, for example, looking just at the wastewater treatment plant, or they could be applied at the city scale. So for example, planting broader shade trees, something like that. So in these next two slides, we'll go ahead and move ahead. I'm going to quickly walk through what some of the adaptation actions that we've heard from the public, from some of these public workshops and surveys, and even directly to the project team's email address, which everyone can email us additional actions after this meeting. So I'm going to quickly go through these just so you can get an idea of what we've already heard, because we're going to get a chance to put in actions later. We're going to have about an hour to do that. And so I'm showing you these because I want the actions that we talk about later to be maybe different than something that we've already heard here, or provide nuance or build upon some of these. So we really want to, get some really good discussion moving in our next phase of this meeting. So quickly, I'll just go through some of the things that we've heard about. So physical actions, like we said, this is a physical intervention. To combat extreme heat, some of the ideas that we've heard is to enhance the urban forest through enhancing street trees, additional vegetation and green space, parks and open space, and that's to help reduce some of the urban cooling. Increasing biking and walking by establishing shade corridors on biking and walking routes, which does two things. It helps those routes be more comfortable for people who are going to be doing that in the heat, which may also encourage folks to bike and walk more and reduce their car trips. Informational actions for all of the hazards. This is going to be extreme heat, flooding, air quality, is for the city to help you stay in the know, provide information for local conditions and hazards such as wildfire, air quality, extreme heat, or providing text alerts to notify citizens of those different additional hazards, air quality, poor air quality days, extreme heat, or flooding events throughout the city. Next slide. So some examples of some of the governance actions that we've heard is during smoke and heat events, improving buses and improving buses and trains during extreme heat and poor air quality events to reduce the amount of time that people are waiting outside, expand access to cooling or weather relief centers or emergency shelters during those heat or poor air quality events or during power outages, or potentially providing N95 masks to people during these bad air days. To combat drought and promote water conservation. Another governance action that we heard is to incentivize residential nature-based stormwater conservation systems. So doing a stormwater capture off of your roof or your driveway or something like that. So I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Josh, who's going to talk to us a little bit about greenhouse gas reduction.
Great, thanks, Diana. I'm going to set the stage for the greenhouse gas mitigation action development, share some more detailed input like Diana did, things that we've heard from the public about action ideas and challenges, and then introduce the Mural engagement platform that Carrie referenced at the start of the meeting that we're going to use for an interactive conversation with you all next. The ambition of the greenhouse gas mitigation actions should be informed by the city's emissions inventory and forecast to make sure we're being aggressive with our actions in the right areas. The figure here on the left, the bar charts, shows what we call an adjusted business as usual forecast. This particular scenario estimates how the city's emissions could change in the community into the future if no further action is taken to curtail their growth, with the exception of implementing several important pieces of legislation or policy frameworks. That includes the state's renewables portfolio standard, which requires increasing amounts of renewable electricity, implementation of state vehicle emissions-focused programs, and implementation of the city's general plan, which has assumptions for things like the numbers of jobs and houses in Davis and how people will get around in the future. So based on those assumptions, building electricity and on-road transportation emissions would decrease through 2040 through implementation of those programs I mentioned, while all other emission sources would be expected to see modest growth, and that's based on expected population and employment growth in Davis. The figure on the right, in this figure, the solid pink line there represents these same business as usual emissions forecasts. Then there's a series of 3 dotted lines underneath those, and those represent potential target options. The gap or the distance between the pink line and those dotted lines represents the amount of emissions reductions that we need to achieve the targets. And by 2040, all emissions have to go, since we're aiming for 0 in this instance. So the previous slide showed that the majority of emissions, of the city's emissions, are coming from on-road transportation, how we get around, vehicles and cars. And there are a number of challenges that we need to consider if we want to see large reductions in this area, particularly given how ambitious we're being as a community with our greenhouse gas reductions. In particular, about 95% of the vehicle travel in the city's inventory are from trips that commute into or out of the city. So that's things like students and employees who live in West Sacramento or Woodland and drive into the city, into Davis each day. Those trips tend to be longer in distance, with little or no walking or bike use and very low transit use. By contrast, the remaining 5% of trips are their internal trips. They're the city's travel within the boundary, within the community. And those tend to be shorter distances, and there you see a higher proportion of walking, biking, and transit. So achieving the city's interim 2030 target is likely going to require substantial action here around these transportation-based emissions, and achieving carbon neutrality by 2040 is going to need incredibly aggressive action here. Some of the challenges that were identified in the previous portions of engagement it noted that community values might not align with this ambitious travel reduction strategy. There's a real jobs housing imbalance here that results in these significant commuting trips. There's also not really any low-hanging fruit that's left in Davis in this instance. So the city has already done a really great job using conventional strategies given its land use characteristics. And now we're faced with more complex solutions or harder trade-offs. There are challenges in that intra-city transit, the transit that operates within the city, is currently primarily organized around facilitating student trips to and from the campus. Intercity trips, those trips coming outside of Davis and into the community, are really challenged by their transit options, and they tend to be expensive to operate, and they have relatively low ridership. And finally, I'll just note that right now there's no travel time or financial incentive for biking and transit, so private vehicles tend to be the preferred option. So several of those high-level challenges were also highlighted by participants in Workshop 1, the Equity Workshop, and Survey 1. And through those comments, potential solutions were either stated or implied. Commenters said things like, transit doesn't go where I need it to go, or it takes too long. So we probably need to increase the service area, the reliability, the frequency, and or make it free. There's a feeling that personal vehicles are needed for flexibility. So things like promoting Zipcar or shared electric vehicles for those in-commuters were listed as potential solutions. There's currently lots of interest and past action on electric vehicle use, but there's still plenty of concern about charging access and costs. People suggested rebates or incentives for EV purchases, as well as mandatory EV charging in new and existing apartments. And finally, bike infrastructure. Lots of reported bike use, obviously, and plenty of issues still identified, including poor maintenance of bikeway surfaces, lighting problems and security concerns, and again, this time trade-off that is implied within certain biking trips. And some other mobility ideas that we've started collecting include things like land use planning approaches that could increase housing within the city to offset some of these high-level challenges that I identified. Pairing intercity transit with low carbon options that can then disperse riders throughout the city in a way that gives them the flexibility that people say is lacking. This could be things like a micro mobility on-demand service that's similar to Via in West Sacramento. It could be an electric car-to-go system like Gig in Sacramento. And this is where you could see bike facility improvements as well. There could be disincentives as well to personal vehicle use. So things like revising parking requirements or constraining roadway capacity to improve transit use, particularly on multi-arterials like Russell or Covell, or adding bus queue jump areas instead of more car capacity interchanges. So the city could commit to only funding projects that are going to increase transit capacity, not just private vehicles. Okay, we are still on time. So that was just a quick primer on what we've heard so far regarding climate adaptation and the greenhouse gas reduction opportunities so far. Now we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so hearing your ideas too. So once I'm done here, everyone's going to be sorted into smaller breakout groups through your audio on Zoom. Each group is going to have a facilitator and a note taker as well to help out with the conversations. We're going to spend the first 25 minutes discussing mobility ideas. Then we're going to move the conversation on to discussing public space ideas for another 25 minutes. As was mentioned earlier in this presentation, Workshop 3, which is happening in about 2 weeks, is going to have a similar format as today. And that's where we're going to focus on discussing things like building action ideas, as well as the water and solid waste action ideas. So while today's focus is on mobility and public spaces, you will have the opportunity to share your ideas on buildings, water, and waste during Workshop 3. So I'm now going to attempt to share another screen. Let me see if I can do this right. Okay. I'm going to share this screen to briefly orient everyone in Mural. So Mural is like a big dry erase board that everyone can simultaneously add sticky notes to in real time. I've zoomed out all the way here so you can see the full extent, but it's been a really helpful tool during the pandemic to safely replicate some of those more collaborative aspects of in-person workshops. So each breakout group today is going to be working within a different color-coded area of this board, either the purple, orange, blue, or pink areas. All of those areas start with the same initial content. And I'm going to zoom in now to the purple group just to give everyone a bit more of an overview of this exercise. So once we are in our Zoom breakout groups, your group facilitator is going to share a web link within the Zoom chat that you can use to access Mural as a visitor. You're not going to need to sign up for anything. Once you're in the platform, you can move around the same way that you would within a PDF or other web-based spaces. You can click with your left mouse button and drag around to pan the screen. You can use the scroll wheel on your mouse or the plus and minus keys to zoom in and out. Each group has 2 tables that we're going to discuss today. The first table that we're looking at here is called Mobility, and then I will scroll over, and to the right there's a table similarly set up, which is the Public Spaces table. We go back to Mobility real quick. Under the heading of each of those tables is a statement of what we're trying to solve for today. So I'm going to zoom in. You can zoom in very close. I know some of the font can be very small, but feel free to get in as close as you need. The solving for statement is telling us that what kind of actions are we trying to elicit from this conversation today. So in mobility, we are trying to come up with actions that would provide greenhouse gas reductions, as well as address equity issues and address wildfire or air quality, heat and flooding. So we want your your ideas on greenhouse gas reductions and climate adaptation actions today. Zoom out a little bit to show you that each table also has several subheadings to help organize topically where the comments might go. So here in mobility, we have a section on buses and trains. There's a column called reduce car use. There's one for live, work, and play, and that's about urban planning type strategies. There's one for electric cars, and finally one for biking, walking, and rolling. You'll also notice that there are already a handful of big purple sticky notes in here. We wanted to provide a couple seed actions in here just to get the ball rolling. And these are from comments that we've already heard from the public through those other engagement activities I mentioned earlier. So the purpose of today's exercise is to fill these boards with more comments, with more sticky notes, more ideas for additional actions that we should consider to be included within the CAP. And we want to fill them in within these topic areas. If something doesn't fit perfectly within a topic area, that's fine. Add it anywhere within your space that you want to. All of the comments are going to come back to us. Which brings me to the most important lesson to show everybody is how do you add a sticky note. And it's very simple. You just double click and a new post-it note is going to appear. And you can type in the comment. If you don't like where you put it, you can just click the note and drag it somewhere else. Double click, you add a new note. It's as easy as that. We do recognize that technology, especially new technology, if people have not used this before, can sometimes be off-putting, or even the technology itself is uncooperative. So you can also share your ideas in a couple different ways today. You can double click to add these sticky notes like I just showed you. You can enter your ideas within the Zoom chat, or you can share your comments verbally and ask that your note taker put them into a sticky note for you. All of the comments, no matter how you make them, are going to come back to the project team at the end. So no matter which participation option you're going to choose. I would also note that today is not a popularity contest. So if you see a comment on the board, an idea that you like, you don't need to write it again. You don't need to add a note that says, I agree. We are trying to collect a full suite of potential action ideas here, but we're not trying to express preference for some over others today. And then finally, I'll just note that the most engaging breakout groups that I've been in using this approach have had a mix of talking, verbal communication, and note posting. So I would encourage you all to start or join a dialogue to share your ideas with your fellow participants within your breakout group. And if you're comfortable, summarize them in a sticky note too, or ask the note taker for help. So with that, we're going to sort everyone into breakout groups and give you your own Mural links within the Zoom chats. And once you're in there, feel free to test it out and get comfortable for a few minutes before we get started. Thank you, and I'll see you all in there.
So I just wanted to apologize. Our normal meeting facilitator was unable to join us today, so Carrie and I are trying to figure this out. I am going to attempt to put everybody in the breakout rooms. If it doesn't work immediately, be patient, we'll get there. The other thing I'm noticing is I do not see the chat function for Zoom right now. So I'm not sure why we're not seeing it in this meeting, but if we go into the breakout rooms and we still don't see it, we may need another option, Josh, for getting everybody the link. I'm not sure how else to get people the link. So anyway, let's try the breakout rooms. If it doesn't work, we'll come back and try something else. So
yeah. Diane, I'm going to try to open all the rooms and have them be sorted automatically. And also I want to ask the facilitators and note takers to remember to record your session. They should be nice, small enough groups for everybody to be able to speak up. So I'm going to try that right now.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. That was great. I had some great discussion in my group, as I'm sure you all did. And sorry about our technical difficulties, but I did just take a little walk around the board, and it looks like all 4 groups were able to at least have some access to the boards. We'll have these boards open for the next couple of weeks, so as you continue to generate ideas and think this through and talk with your friends and family, as I know you're all going to do later tonight over dinner. You can add more ideas. You can also email those directly to the project team, and we'll collect those and make sure that those get recorded as part of our process here. So I'm going to take you through our next steps before we wrap up, and frankly, before we get to the raffle. I registered today, but I'm not sure that I'm actually in the running. But it's always worth a shot. Carrie, Diana. All right, so where do we go from here? So like I said, the mural boards are going to be up for another couple of weeks. We have our additional meetings in 2 weeks. That's going to be very similar to this, working in the mural boards. We will have worked out some of the kinks by then. We're going to be talking about buildings and then waste and water at that time. Those actions that we've received today and receive on the mural boards will get, again, added to our running list, which will then, consolidate and come up with this targeted list of actions that we'll then evaluate and begin to draft some priorities. And these priorities, of course, are going to be based on greenhouse gas reduction opportunity, the ability to improve equity, and then through some of the community preferences and priorities that we've heard today. We also will be releasing a survey number 2. I know everyone here took survey number 1. We'll be releasing that early next week. And that'll, again, be about kind of getting an idea of what actions and preferences the community would like to see in the climate action and adaptation plan. So once you're done with the survey, email it to 5 of your friends who work, live, or go to school in Davis. That would be really appreciated. And that's all we have for tonight. Thanks again for living with us through some of the bumps of this meeting, but I think we managed to come up with some really great ideas. And I will turn it over to Carrie.
Well, thank you, Diana. I think the last thing that we need to do is to do our raffle prize. And on the screen is a photo of the farmers market basket that we put together. We have one for each of the meetings. And if I don't say so myself, they're pretty exciting with some produce from the market and some other goodies. And the only prerequisite was to pre-register by the deadline and be here in the meeting. And so we randomly selected someone for the basket. And drum roll, please. Chelsea Becker is the one that came up as the winner. So Chelsea, I hope that I have your contact information, and I will reach out to you in order to deliver the basket to you. So if you did not win the basket, or even if you did, please plan to attend the Buildings, Waste, and Water workshops at the end of July. And of course, you're also welcome to come on Friday for this same workshop if you have the appetite for that. So we will stay on the call for more time for people to be able to make some comments, but as it's just about 6:30 now, in the interest of time, we're going to finish up the regular portion of our program and allow people to have additional comments in a sort of a freestyle program. So we really appreciate everyone being here. And Diana, I'd like to give you a chance to say a few things.
Thanks, Carrie. Again, apologies for not having the chat function work on Zoom, but we'll work on that one. But we really appreciate everybody taking the time, and the breakout groups were small enough, I think, that we were able to get through it, and our note takers did a great job of adding to Mural. And I really would, encourage people to let others know that the Mural board will be up for a couple weeks, and they can get in there and add comments. So even if they didn't attend today's meeting, they'll be able to do that. And the recording of this meeting will be available within a few days as well. So thanks so much. And please, if you have other comments you'd like to make now? I think we're a small enough group. You know, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just make a comment or ask a question. And if it gets too crazy busy, we'll have people raise their hands.
Thank you, staff. Thank you, Carrie, for this wonderful outreach program and the wonderful design. This is a wonderful process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan.
I'd like to ask the question I asked in the small group to Joshua about this 95% of we're not sure what, cars, emissions, VMT, being traffic in and out of town compared to traffic within city boundaries. It doesn't sound like a correct number.
You may be muted if you're talking.
I lost my unmute button.
There you go.
It was the measure of the mileage traveled. So I'm trying to recall the PowerPoint presentation that I saw from our traffic consultant on this, and I believe the number of trips were approximately split 50-50. Half of the trips were what they called internal trips, where you start and end within the city, and the other half were external, where you start and or end within the city. So in terms of number of trips, they were about even.
Mm-hmm.
Challenge in Davis is that you are surrounded by a causeway and not much else. So any of those trips that were external trips are vastly longer in duration than those internal trips. I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but I think the external trips were approximately or averaging 8 miles, and the internal trips were averaging 1 mile or so, which is how you ended up with such a skewed distribution of the total mileage relative to what type of trip it was.
So it's based on mileage and presumably then GHG production. One last question related to that. The trips to the university, do they count as trips out of town?
Okay, wow, you're a ringer. These are really detailed questions. The way the model is set up is that if the start or end node of the trip is at the university, those trips are not included in the community's inventory. What the model is not sensitive to pick up are a student who lives in Woodland and commutes to Davis and parks within the city. They don't park at a parking garage on campus. So that VMT would be reflected as a City of Davis responsible VMT. So those emissions are allocated to the city in that instance, if that makes sense.
What about the student who lives in Davis and drives to campus? How is that counted?
Could you say that again?
A student who lives in the city and drives to campus.
Yeah, so again, if one end of the trip is on the campus, then those emissions are not included in the City of Davis inventory. The idea is that the University of Davis is accounting for those trips and emissions within their own inventory.
Is there a way to get from the university how many cars are used on a daily basis by people who live in Davis to their facilities?
So I'm having trouble hearing, but I don't think I have that detailed answer right now either way.
So what you're saying is that this is a different way of calculating? I mean, it was always my understanding that half the trips were always, if you had a round trip out of town and back, one half of that got counted on the city's part, and the other half would be counted at the destination. So that's always been my understanding of how trips were counted.
There are two options available. What you just described is the, I'll forget what it stands for, but it's called the RTAC methodology. And you're exactly right that if one end of the trip is in a community and the other is in another community, you could say we're responsible for half of this VMT and that other destination is responsible for the other half. There is another approach which is similar, but it's called the full accounting methodology, which tends to align more closely with CEQA transportation analysis, and in that instance, instead of only taking 50% credit for those trips, you would take 100% credit, or responsibility, that is, for those trips and emissions. We have the numbers for Davis for both of those instances, and right now we are starting from this full accounting methodology while we start to evaluate what the greenhouse gas reduction opportunities are. If we decide that it is too problematic to finalize the analysis using that approach, we can change to the RTAC methodology, which is also still pretty consistently applied within California. They're both options available.
So in the region, do you have any idea? I mean, part of this is that we're playing with other players here in Yolo County, and do you have a sense of what's being used in our region?
I can only.
It seems like we should be consistent.
I know a couple instances, but not enough to speak about the region comprehensively. I know of one that's using the RTAC methodology like I described with this 50% allocation. Off the top of my head, Davis is the only one that I know who's using the full allocation, but this would be a question that I would want to get more clarity from on our transportation sub, who would deal with this more regularly than I do.
I think it's really key in Yolo County that we use a similar methodology across all communities, whatever that methodology is.
Well, as far as methodologies go, wouldn't it be more fair to assign the number of miles driven? For instance, you're going to Woodland, it's a 13-mile drive. You're spending 1 mile in the city of Davis and then 13 miles intercity versus inner city, as opposed to giving it 50% of the load?
So this is amazing. I didn't expect all of these detailed transportation questions. That is one additional option for how you can evaluate greenhouse gas emissions, and that is called a geographic boundary. And it's just like it sounds. You draw a boundary around the city and you count all of the mileage that happens within that boundary. The things that would be included for Davis within that would be traffic on I-80. That's traffic, just pass-through trips. Those are emissions that you can't influence. You're not causing them to occur. You just happen to have infrastructure within your jurisdiction. The other challenge with the geographic boundary is that it doesn't really fairly allocate the cause for the length of that trip. So because a small portion of the trip is in Davis and the rest is en route to Woodland, what is causing that trip in the first place? It's the mismatch in jobs in housing at the most basic level.
For transportation, for that matter.
Yeah, or transportation infrastructure, right?
Joshua, it's really important to have this information and the details of that. That's really, really critically important. I hope you share that. Especially the transit district, Yolo Bus, and the Unitrans should have this information for planning. The second is, it sounds like if we widen I-80 so we can get more Tahoe traffic through there quicker, it's not on our nickel. Our GHG missiles, but somehow it's a free ride. And so I guess there's an anomaly there. That's guilt-free freeway widening, and I wonder whether that's that we should be aware of that.
Does the city of Davis
to give a little bit more information to what Joshua had said, I believe that as we met with some of the key city leaders and the transportation consultant, we're not considering the geographic boundary because that's not really used generally as a transportation model, but we are getting information for both of the other models. And so as Josh said, we can, veer one way or the other. And the full, Josh, what was the name? The full transportation model, the value of that is that it's a more stringent standard that causes us to do more GHG reduction. However, we also need to identify what does it mean for our community to be carbon neutral, and we don't want to play with that in the sense of not trying to address that, but we do have those options for making sure that we're using accurate information. one of the things about our region is that not everyone is at the same place with their climate action planning. So we don't know what every community is doing because they're at a different path along the way. So we can match what the communities that are doing their climate action planning are doing, such as West Sacramento, which is at about the same stage we are, and try to meet what Yolo County is doing, but some of the other communities are not yet doing it. So I think what we need to do is use our best practices for Davis and identify what those practices are so that it's very transparent. And as to John's question for the 95%, in further discussion about that, there were some questions about whether, well, if it's a longer distance trip, does it emit less GHG? And what the consultant said was that there may be a slight change in that, but it's not significant. So maybe it would go from 95 to 94%, but it's not going to go from 95 to 70% or something like that. So we are relying on the expertise of our transportation consultant who has worked with most of the communities in this area. And we all still need to understand better what they're doing. And with some of the reporting that will be coming out, we will be understanding that better. So hopefully that wasn't getting too detailed, but I did want to address a couple of those things that we've talked about already with Fair and Peers and others at the city.
I'd like just to remind people too that, we are trying to get at what is really truly our responsibility. And Cool Davis with households uses a life cycle model, which is to look at all the stuff you actually do, all the stuff you purchase, all the things you eat, and do inside the community and outside the community. And truly, we are all responsible for those things. And so it's important for us to, as a community, look as closely as we can at what we have control of over with our decision making and make the changes we need to make in order to respond to the climate crisis. So,
may I ask a question? And it has to do with my lack of knowledge of this area because I'm new here. With regards to the widening of I-80, how much say does the city of Davis have in that design process?
Yolo County Transportation Board is it's the co-lead agency on this thing. And we have 2 of the 5 members of the Yolo County Transportation Board are Davis residents. You have Don Saylor and Lucas Ferrix. So we have a considerable say of what that widening looks like. So
that's good.
I'm also I'm on the project delivery team, and so I get to meet with the Caltrans delivery group monthly and weigh in on their what they're doing with design.
I'll jump in to say this might be a good time for the raise hand feature. We're getting some good discussion. So if anyone wants that, it's under reactions.
John.
So the reason I was focusing on the 95% is that if you look at the inventory and you are saying 70%-ish of the total emissions are transportation and 95% of those are out-of-town trips, then a lot of our attention about whether we encourage people to bicycle around town or not is really on the margin. We really should be focusing on intercity transportation and reducing those miles, which was an unexpected result or unexpected outcome that I was thinking. But it really we should be thinking about shaping our plan in that direction.
Build a wall.
Well, I think in addition to what you just said, John, I think that it does go beyond transportation only and looking at what are our land uses and what's our, job creation and housing and transportation balance. And so those are some hard questions that the community is going to need to answer. And when we come back in October, some of those issues and different scenarios will be on the table for the community to discuss. So there's no single topic, even transportation that is by itself responsible for our emissions. It's the interrelationship of all of these components that we need to address. Other comments? Chris?
It's also about changing the emissions of those transportation miles. And so one question I have is how any of the people who have electric vehicles are using those for commuting, and how is that incorporated into the analysis? The city has set goals for a number of electric vehicles, but strategies to accelerate the electrification of our local fleet might be a part of this.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mark.
Thanks. I asked this question in our breakout room, and we will refer to Joshua for a better answer. And the question was, how much of our planned or desired offset for greenhouse gases will have to rely on offsets, and how much of that will be through reduction of actual emissions?
I think that's a good question, and the answer at this point is it remains to be seen. So right now we're collecting the ideas on the actions. There's an action development and refinement process. There's an action evaluation process to say, okay, of these actions we're looking at, what is their actual greenhouse gas reduction potential? How does that compare to that emissions forecast scenario that I showed? And what emissions are left? What are those emissions that we're not speaking to? And it is likely, if not a certainty, that there's going to be some amount of emissions left in that 2040 scenario that we just don't know feasibly how we're going to reduce those by 2040. And those are the ones that you would be looking to, I guess, buy carbon credits to balance them, or fund carbon removal projects to balance those emissions. We have not gotten to that point of the conversation yet, so we don't know exactly how many of those emissions are left.
Thanks, Joshua. I'll just follow up by making pointing out that on campus where UC Davis professes to be very, very green, and it turns out that they have also fallen into the trap of going for sometimes the cheapest offsets, which are not always the ones that are even adding anything positive to the discussion. I mean, I think that was a piece of the Sacramento basically saying that some of the offsets that the UC system in general is making went to facilitating flaming off of methane gas in landfills somewhere else in the U.S., which is hardly the best way of preventing greenhouse gas emissions. So it is a difficult debate as to what is a meaningful offset if such a thing exists.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, and I agree. We have not discussed with Carrie yet what that conversation needs to look like, but there presumably needs to be some type of framework put in place that defines what types of carbon credits or carbon removal projects does the city want to support when they're showing how they're going to balance the remaining emissions.
Great. Thank you for at least acknowledging and being aware that there's a big difference here in how you potentially go about doing this.
John, do you have a residual hand up, or did you have another comment?
That's a new one. I'd like to change the subject for a moment. Diana, on your last slide, you talked about in next steps setting priorities, and I was curious about the process and who's going to be setting those priorities. You listed a couple things up there like equity and GHG emission reduction, of course, but I didn't see things like public health, for instance, and so that's what got me thinking about, well, who is it that's going to set these priorities?
Great question.
And do you want me to?
Yeah, how about I'll take the first crack at it, Josh,
Yep.
and you can add on to that. These priorities, there's some of we're going to be sending this through an evaluation criteria or evaluation process, and some of the criteria is feasibility and feasibility, GHG reduction. Is it, are these actions helping us meet our goals? Some of the other priorities and that we will be looking at are some of the co-benefits that we've been asking about in these workshops and these meetings. What are some of these additional? I think the question in the survey is, what are some additional benefits that you'd like to see come out of that? I know that Carrie shared some of those additional co-benefits. So those are going to be some of the priorities and things that we're kind of filtering this through, and then looking at taking the list from there, bringing these priorities back to the community and really confirming that and making sure, like, yes, this is what you've told us, this is what we've heard. Is this correct? Anything to add, Josh?
I was just going to wait to see if John had a follow-on question, I think.
Yeah.
Did a good job summarizing.
It was just that I don't remember seeing public health as part of Carrie's co-benefits, or I saw air quality, for instance, but public health was the one that comes to my mind.
Well, I don't think that what I showed on the screen was an exhaustive list of everything that we're going to consider. That was based on a question that was in the first survey, which was just as we were starting. Equity was not on there either, but we have heard very loudly and clearly that equity and addressing those needs is a very high priority in the community. So we need to incorporate the comments that we've already heard. Better air quality is related to public health, but there are other issues that are also related to public health. So the tool that AECOM has provided is very flexible to meet the needs of our community. And we are going to have to use some of the preset standards that are in that tool and then adapt them and adjust them and talk about them and put some of the actions through that tool and see if it's working. And some of that will come to the Natural Resources Commission. There will be other ways that we will vet that tool. And some of it is going to be intuitive, and it doesn't matter what the tool says. We know we want to do certain things. So there's no set absolute process that it's just like, well, if this says this, then that's what we're going to do. We're going to use the available tools to address the strategies that have been brought up by the community and make sure that we do get the GHG reduction values that we need, that the actions that we select or strategies that we select and prioritize meet our other co-benefit needs, and that they're actually feasible, that we have local control over them. I mean, as somebody said before, we can't decide that we're going to change the way I-80 is designed. That's not within our power, but we can change some of our transportation issues and what we're doing. So local control and cost effectiveness. And so it's everything is interconnected, and we will be doing our best to be transparent about what those evaluations are. And as Josh has said in previous meetings with city staff, if some of the results that come out don't meet what we feel our community values and needs are, we can make adjustments in how we evaluate those things to make sure that certain values rise to the top, say equity. If we select an action for transportation that turns out to show that it is not an equitable action, like, give an electric car to everybody who owns a home in Davis, is that, equitable? No. So we have to adjust that action to make it meet our needs for diversity and equity. So that was a bit rambling, but that's kind of what we're trying to do. And
I'll make one last point, and then I'll shut up. I'll just put in a vote for a good, robust public discussion of priorities as well as actions. and not decide via the technical advisory committee or somebody else what the priorities should be.
So for some reason I can't find the raise hand function because there's no chat window. But I'm going to jump in here and say, John, I actually asked for this to be on the next NRC agenda.
And then we
I didn't have my, sorry, I don't have a hand up function. I keep on trying to do a reaction to do it because I can't find a hand up function. So, but I was just jumping in to say to John, I'm asking that this be on the NRC agenda for the next meeting. I already submitted an agenda item to talk about this. So, and I do want to say, just commend, the other thing I wanted to say is commend the city staff and for the mechanics of this workshop. There was a lot of opportunities to put in good input from what I could tell. So it worked quite well. Thank you.
Thanks. Lorenzo.
Yeah, you partially answered this, but I'd like you to say a little bit more about feasibility. What all factors into a feasibility judgment?
Well, again, I think, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this, but feasibility has to do with, does it meet other city, partly does it meet other city goals and strategies that have been identified by our community and city council, but mainly it's about what is the cost, and does the cost meet the value of what you're trying to do, and then can we do it? Is it possible for us to state a certain action and actually make it happen? Do we have control over that action? Is it something that we can do? And so I don't know how to define it more than that, but some of the evaluation criteria will address more specifics about that. Diana or Josh or Diana Jensen, do you have anything to add to that? You're on mute, Josh.
Double clicked. There's a couple different ways you can consider feasibility, and we would often think about it the same way we do co-benefits. You can't evaluate an exhaustive list of things. Then you end up with analysis paralysis, and you'll never make a decision. So you try to identify what are the most important considerations. In other cities, some have, like Carrie said, looked at that question: is this within our direct control? If it's not, what are the tiers? What's the hierarchy of control? So we can understand at a more granular level where our ability is to pull this lever. Regarding funding, when you're doing an initial assessment of actions, you're not going to do a full economic cost analysis of any potential draft action, but you can say, would implementing this require additional funding, or is it something that can be handled by available funding sources? Do we know what funding sources are available, or would we have to go out and identify some? Other feasibility considerations in communities might be, does this action have high favor with elected officials? Are they likely to help it pass? Likewise, does it have high support community-wide, or is there a known opposition to this? Those are all different questions you can ask to understand how easy or hard might this action be to implement. And that's only one consideration in prioritization, but it can be important, because you want to pick actions that are impactful, that are going to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and climate risk. You also want actions that are going to provide the community benefits you think are important. You also want actions that are feasible, that can be implemented. You probably are not going to find a CAP that's full of actions that check all of those boxes. It's going to be a gradation. So the prioritization process is trying to balance all of those evaluation outcomes to say, okay, some of our actions have high greenhouse gas reductions, but they only provide minimal co-benefits, but we need them for the greenhouse gas reductions. Some give us high co-benefits, but they have lower feasibility, but we need them because they're important for other community goals. That's all part of the facilitated and negotiated process of identifying those priorities. And it's the framework or the tool that we're using is meant to do this in a transparent and methodical approach, so that you can consider all of these multiple inputs for a longer list of actions and feel like you did a reasonably adequate job at trying to balance all of these needs all at once.
Thank you.
I'm going to say call on Marcus, and then I'm going to ask if there's anyone that hasn't been able to raise their hand. If you want to put your video on and raise your hand in real time, and we'll make sure that everybody gets a chance to comment who has not yet commented. Marcus.
Would it be wise to recommend to the city and the city council to actually have a line item in the budget for whatever projects are recommended, as opposed to leaving it only to the departments to work out within their budgets? So to have actually have them vote on a line item amount of money that can then be distributed to projects based on the priorities decided through this process.
That seems like an excellent idea to me. Diana?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that is definitely something that we're going to be engaging our Assistant City Manager, Ash Feeney, with when we start talking about implementing all of these actions and how best to do it, and how we make sure that, you know, what the climate action plan comes up with actually occurs and gets implemented. And that'll be, you know, one of the things that gets talked about with City Council is what kind of mechanism do we put in place to make sure that we're making progress towards these actions and goals.
And that will be part of the recommendations in the CAP, is actually implementation framework for what we can do, because I think that what you've seen from us is that we're very dedicated to making sure that this is a plan that has the action part of it identified. Was there anybody else that wanted to say something that hasn't had a chance to speak up? And if not, Chris.
This is back to the priorities and the what has been called criteria. And I think one of the questions that I've heard from a number of people is, who decides how the criteria is evaluated? That is, some of this is about measurement. So how is it that we're measuring equity? Joshua just described how we might measure feasibility. Who decides what gets considered in feasibility or doesn't get considered in feasibility? Is that happening in the TAC and with the staff group and the consultant, and it's already built into the tool in some ways? And how do we see that? How do we understand that as we're looking at priorities? So the back end of this process is to actually be seeing these priorities in some kind of ranking. But if we don't understand how the criteria was built, then how do we know what it means?
Well, what I will say is that this is going to be an iterative process. There's not going to be a set of criteria that are established and then they're set in stone and we can't go back and take a look at them. So once we have this evaluative tool identified with criteria that are going to help us rank these in priorities, we will make that public. It will be available on the website. People will be able to comment on it. It will be presented at the next set of workshops as part of the recommendations that are there. And the other thing I will say is that the Technical Advisory Committee is not a decision-making body. They are only providing input to us that we can use as the project management team to vet ideas as we move forward. But they are not voting on anything. They are not a group that has any level of control over this process. The project management team has the control, and that team is using our platform to go out to the community and get input. So I don't know if that was your question. And
I think I was looking for some insight from Diana and Joshua about how they've used this tool maybe with other communities and how that process has worked in terms of the criteria setting.
In terms of selecting the criteria, which is that first step, often we try to get input from the community on what their priorities are that would inform selecting the co-benefits that I would call. Those are the things like air quality improvement, public health improvement, public safety, expanding local job development. We often would work directly with the city staff who will be charged with implementing the plan to select what feasibility criteria they think are most important to consider and understand how feasible would an action be. When those criteria are selected and put into the tool, which is an Excel-based tool, the next step is evaluating all of the draft actions against each of those selected criteria. And we've taken a couple different approaches in this as well. Typically in the US-based cities where we've done this, the consultant team and the city project management team would collaboratively evaluate those actions. And there's usually a couple of sessions where we define, to use your reference, I think, what do we mean by equity in this instance? Like what are we evaluating for equity, and what are the 3 or 5 point scale? What is the 3 or 5 point scale on which we're evaluating these actions? And when it comes up to evaluating these actions, what is our internal rule book? How are we going to interpret a very positive action versus a positive action, or a very negative outcome versus a negative outcome? And we define through a couple of trial and error or testing sessions, we try to define these internal rules so that we are evaluating actions with consistency across the whole list of actions. We've then done 2 different ways. In one instance, our team could just use that guidance and evaluate all of the actions, if the city prefers that as an approach. In other instances, we've done facilitated working sessions with the city staff and have collaboratively evaluated each action for the criteria. In other instances, the city or county team have led evaluation of the feasibility criteria because they're more closely associated with it, and they feel like they have more direct ownership or understanding of those processes. Outside of the US, there have been some instances where stakeholder groups have been assembled and actions have been evaluated in a larger group session. It adds to the time and the expense for the process, but it allows you to get additional input. Another option for that would be, after the initial actions are evaluated, you could do a review process with stakeholder groups, just to say, hey, we've gone through this process. These were the criteria that were selected and how they were evaluated. Does this feel right, or do you want to discuss any of these in detail? Again, back in the US, the last step of that process is interpreting those results to actually identify the priorities. So if you load 150 draft actions into the tool, for example, you might say, our objective is to prioritize about 25 actions. Those are going to be the high priority actions for the CAP. The other actions can be mentioned or listed in the CAP, but our immediate implementation priority are these 25. And that conversation has typically been a facilitated conversation between our team and the city team, or maybe a stakeholder group if the city decides they want to invite another outside group. Then those results are usually shared with the public, as we've talked about here, just for confirmation. Did we get these right? Based on the ideas that you've shared with us up until now and the criteria that we selected, do these priorities feel right? And if not, which 1 or 2 do you think need to be bumped out, and what should they be replaced with?
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate that answer. That was great. So I think the bottom line is that, we're definitely not done in getting input from everybody in this process and what we're doing. And part of that will be discussed at the September meeting, or October, whenever we have the last one.
I think I maybe am particularly maybe becoming more sensitive to the questions that have been raised around equity. That has really made me think more deeply about bias. And I think that, and not just in equity, but in other arenas, each of us comes with our own expertise, our own knowledge, our own experience of this community, and we bring that into the discussion. And so I do think that to the extent we can do a very robust discussion of the criteria and the way the priorities are set would be a very healthy thing for this community. So, I am all for a more robust discussion with stakeholders, if that can be structured into what we're doing.
Lorenzo.
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't going to bring up the TAC, but since you mentioned it, I am really concerned. I understand that they're not a decision-making body, and as far as I can see, that's a way of ensuring that they're legally not subject to the Brown Act. But if you've got a team of 15 experts, why can't the public hear what they have to say? Why can't they have a public discussion and talk to us about their views on the climate action and adaptation plan and what they think is good and why, what they think is not good and why? Why can't we hear all that?
So the TAC specifically is formed as a technical advice to the project management team. It's not the only time we use that particular model of how staff gets their information. We have great staff members with lots of background and different experiences. But we realize that sometimes that's not really enough. And not only do we have the benefit of having, AECOM as our consultant that does have a lot of experience in this specific field, but we felt that there's, always a benefit to reach out to others that have technical expertise. And it's not uncommon to have this type of group on large engineering projects. We actually had a technical advisory group that worked with us for the wastewater treatment plant design. It is a tool that's often used, and mostly it's not a public body. So,
well, yeah. This is not the same thing as an engineering project. This is a moral issue, and it's a society-wide issue. This is really way more serious than an engineering project. And you're making a choice to have them only advise staff when I think the public could benefit from hearing what these experts have to say. So I think this is really an inappropriate decision.
I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Mike, if you are speaking to all of us, you need to unmute.
Carrie, thank you very much. You've got a very complex and difficult task. I think you're doing a good job, and thank you very much.
We're a team. We're a team. So what I will say in response to concerns about the TAC is that we have tried to, what I would suggest that you do if you're concerned is to go to the website, and maybe you've already done this, and read the overview and framework document that we put together and posted on the website, which shows the different ways that we are getting input. So we kind of considered this as a three-part approach. We have our project management and internal team, which includes a group that meets monthly that are all city staff from every department and representative staff liaisons from most commissions. And we get a lot of feedback and input about city structure and processes and programs from that group, because we're trying to, this is a project that ties in with other ongoing projects that the city is doing related to housing, the downtown plan, transportation projects, with Valley Clean Energy, there are a lot of interconnected parts. A second major piece of the input is all of this community input. And that is actually the most important facet of how we're deciding what we're doing. And some of the concerns about what we're evaluating, we've been gathering information from the beginning on what is important to the community? What are these values? And that's what we're using to create the evaluation criteria. And, you know, we may not get everything right at first, but we're going to be bringing it back to the community to vet it all. And then the third area is this technical advisory committee, which could really be considered part of the project management team because that's who they're giving the information to. But as I've said before, there's nothing being presented to the technical advisory committee that has not also been presented in community meetings. So if you want to know what's going on at the TAC, come to the community meetings.
Carrie, you're frozen. Oh, now you're back.
I have an unstable connection. So, but I think that's the main thing I wanted to say. Mostly we just appreciate all of these comments and concerns, but we do have a structure that is now set up, and we are going to make it, all of it, as transparent as we can within the structure that we've established.
So are there any other questions or comments, you know, specifically related to the mobility and public spaces topics that we covered today? I'm looking forward to getting in and looking at all the mural boards. I know that looked like there was a lot of great input. So, Chris?
Only that looking at the list of people that were here today, I do think that maybe we did not, there were a couple other public meetings this evening, and so I'm thinking I may nudge some more people from a few sectors that care deeply about, especially our public spaces, our parks, our tree canopy, to come and participate in Fridays. And I encourage anybody else that's still on the call here to do that too, to encourage people that care deeply about what's going on with transportation, whatever their perspective, to show up for the 10 o'clock or to come to the boards and comment.
We will be sending out the link to the boards to everybody on our e-notification list. When these two mobility and public spaces workshops are done, we can let our commissions know and other people in the community. So we're not going to be done collecting information when we finish these workshops. We're going to still be, the survey is going to address many of these issues, and that will be posted within the week. And so there's, just like the last set of introductory workshops, there's a lot of different ways for people to incorporate their comments. So,
question, is UC Davis an equal partner in this whole process, since many of the trips are their people coming into town?
UC Davis does their own climate action and adaptation plan, and so there are a lot of UC Davis staff, faculty, and students that have participated in the process, but it is not a partner as far as the actions that we come up with will be City of Davis actions, not university actions. We've made a commitment to address these issues in a regional approach, so we are collaborating with our broader Yolo County region and the university, but they are not part of this plan. So I think that answers the question you were asking.
Right. I was just thinking maybe they need more park and rides in the cities where people are coming from, and coordination with transit from that point into the campus. And that would be, Yolo Bus possibly could be contracted to do that for them. They have the new connection into Sacramento that a lot of people are using. That's not just between campuses. So there's some potential there. And a lot of the folks that are doing this commuting, I was thinking about their potential for funding and co-funding with that kind of thing. Yeah.
Good point.
Good point.
Sort of building a network to their bedroom communities.
So, other thoughts, comments, issues? We're coming up on an hour past the end of the workshop, so if there are not additional comments, I think we'll say once again thank you for all of your great input and constructive criticism and thoughts about substantive content. We really appreciate it.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Diana.
Carrie, nice job.
Thanks a bunch.
The tool was great. Went really well.
Good to hear. Thank you.